Captain Sarah Mitchell had heard every joke about female pilots at least a dozen times. The worst part wasn't the jokes themselves, but the way her fellow officers would glance at each other when they thought she wasn't looking. She had earned her wings through blood, sweat, and countless hours in the cockpit, yet some still questioned whether she belonged in the sky. The atmosphere in the officers' club that evening was thick with cigarette smoke and the usual military bravado. Sarah sat quietly at the bar, nursing her drink while listening to the pilots around her swap stories about their latest missions. She had just returned from a successful reconnaissance flight over hostile territory, but nobody seemed interested in hearing about it. "You know what I think?" said Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who had never been told to shut up. "Flying isn't just about technical skill. It's about having the right instincts, the right reflexes. Some people are just naturally built for it." Sarah's grip tightened on her glass. She knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Harrison had been making subtle digs at her competence for months, always careful to couch his comments in language that couldn't be called outright discrimination. Take combat flying. For instance, Harrison continued, warming to his theme. When you're in a real dogfight, when enemy missiles are screaming toward you, you need split-second decision-making. You need to be absolutely ruthless. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Colonel David Chen, the base commander, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Sarah had noticed that Chen often stayed silent when these conversations arose, neither supporting nor condemning the casual sexism that permeated the base culture. "I've flown combat missions," Sarah said quietly, finally turning to face the group. "3 tours, actually. I've been shot at more times than I can count," Harrison smirked. "Transport missions don't really count, do they? I'm talking about real combat, fighter jets, attack aircraft, the kind of flying that separates the professionals from the amateurs." The room fell silent. Sarah felt every eye in the place turn toward her. She had reached the moment that every female military officer dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The moment when she would have to prove herself all over again, despite her years of service and exemplary record. "You think I can't handle real combat aircraft?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention. "I'm not saying you can't, I'm just saying that different people have different strengths. Maybe stick to what you're good at." Sarah stood up slowly, every muscle in her body tense. She had spent years trying to prove herself through quiet competence and professional excellence. She had hoped that her record would speak for itself. But some people only understood one language. "Tell you what, Harrison," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Tomorrow morning you choose any aircraft on this base. Any aircraft at all. I'll fly it and I'll show you exactly what I'm capable of." Harrison's eyes lit up with predatory interest. "Any aircraft?" "Any aircraft. And if you can't handle it?" Sarah's smile was cold as winter steel. "Then you can say whatever you want about female pilots. But when I prove you wrong, you shut your mouth about women in combat for the rest of your career." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Harrison looked around the room, seeing the mixture of excitement and nervousness on the faces of his fellow officers. He had painted himself into a corner, and backing down now would cost him more credibility than losing the bet. "All right," he said finally, "but I get to choose the aircraft and I get to choose the mission parameters." "Agreed. And we do this in front of witnesses. Full documentation. Wouldn't have it any other way." Colonel Chen finally spoke up. "This is highly irregular. I'm not sure I can authorize—" "Sir," Sarah interrupted. "This is about more than just one pilot's capabilities. This is about proving that competence isn't determined by gender. I'm willing to put my career on the line to make that point." Chen studied her face for a long moment. He had watched Sarah Mitchell excel in every assignment she had been given. He had seen her handle emergency situations with calm professionalism that would have broken lesser pilots. But he also knew the political realities of military life. "Very well," he said finally, "but this will be conducted as an official evaluation exercise. Full safety protocols, full documentation, and my final approval on the aircraft selection." Harrison nodded eagerly. "Fair enough. But I still get to choose what she flies." Sarah extended her hand to shake on the agreement. "Looking forward to it." As she walked out of the officers' club, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. She had just committed herself to a challenge that could either vindicate everything she had worked for or destroy her career entirely. But she was tired of fighting quiet battles against whispered doubts. Tomorrow she would let her flying do the talking. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with a harsh wind cutting across the airfield. Sarah had barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing aircraft specifications and emergency procedures in her mind. She knew that Harrison would choose the most challenging aircraft available, something designed to make her fail. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the base like wildfire. As Sarah walked toward the briefing room, she could feel the weight of dozens of stares following her progress. Some faces showed support, others skepticism, and a few displayed the kind of eager anticipation that people reserve for watching potential disasters unfold. Colonel Chen was already waiting in the briefing room when she arrived, along with Harrison and several other senior officers. The atmosphere was tense, formal, and charged with unspoken expectations. "Captain Mitchell," Chen began, "before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what you're committing to. Lieutenant Commander Harrison has selected an aircraft that is challenging even for experienced combat pilots." Harrison's grin was predatory. "I've chosen the A-10 Thunderbolt II, specifically the one that just came out of maintenance after extensive modifications. It's been fitted with new avionics, upgraded weapon systems, and a modified engine configuration that makes it significantly more powerful than standard A-10s. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. The A-10 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Warthog, was a beast of an aircraft. Built around a massive 30mm cannon that could shred tanks like paper, it was designed for close air support missions in hostile environments. It was tough, deadly, and notoriously difficult to fly, especially for pilots who weren't specifically trained on the platform. Furthermore, Harrison continued, the mission parameters will simulate a close air support scenario. You'll need to navigate to a target zone under simulated enemy fire, identify and engage multiple ground targets with precision strikes, and extract while avoiding surface-to-air missile threats. "And if the weather deteriorates?" asked Major Rodriguez, the base operations officer. "The mission continues unless visibility drops below minimum safety standards," Harrison replied. "Captain Mitchell claims she can handle any aircraft under any conditions. Let's see if that's true." Sarah studied the mission briefing documents that were placed in front of her. The parameters were indeed challenging, requiring the kind of precision flying and tactical awareness that took most A-10 pilots months to develop. Harrison had clearly designed the scenario to exploit every possible weakness. "How long do I have to familiarize myself with the aircraft?" she asked. "Standard pre-flight inspection time. 30 minutes with the technical manuals, then you fly." The room fell silent. 30 minutes was barely enough time for an experienced A-10 pilot to review the modified systems, let alone for someone who had never flown the aircraft before. "That's not nearly sufficient time for," began Major Rodriguez. "It's fine," Sarah interrupted. 30 minutes is plenty." Colonel Chen looked uncomfortable. "Captain, I have to advise you that this is extremely irregular. The A-10 requires specialized training, and these modifications make it even more complex. Perhaps we should consider a different aircraft or extend the preparation time." Sarah shook her head. "No, sir. I accepted the challenge as presented. I won't ask for special accommodations now." Harrison's smile widened. "Excellent. I was hoping you'd say that." As the briefing concluded, Sarah found herself walking toward the hangar with a growing sense of both dread and determination. The A-10 Thunderbolt was waiting for her like a sleeping monster, its distinctive twin engines and straight wings giving it an appearance that was both ungainly and menacing. The aircraft was enormous, much larger than anything she had flown before. Its titanium armor plating gleamed dully in the hangar lights, and the massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from its nose looked capable of destroying anything that crossed its path. Chief Master Sergeant Maria Santos, the head of aircraft maintenance, approached her with a concerned expression. "Captain, I've been working on military aircraft for 22 years, and I've never seen modifications like these. This bird is powerful, but it's also unpredictable. The engine modifications have changed its flight characteristics significantly." "What kind of changes?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the aircraft's armored skin. "More power means more torque, which means it wants to roll unexpectedly during certain maneuvers. The new avionics are incredibly sophisticated, but they're also complex enough to overwhelm pilots who aren't familiar with the systems. And the weapons package," Santos shook her head. "Let's just say it's not forgiving if you make mistakes." Sarah climbed up onto the aircraft to begin her inspection. The cockpit was a bewildering array of displays, switches, and controls, far more complex than the aircraft she was used to flying. She had 30 minutes to understand systems that most pilots spent weeks learning. "Captain," Santos called up to her, "if you need more time, I'm sure Colonel Chen would." "Thanks, Sergeant, but I'll be fine." As Sarah settled into the pilot's seat and began reviewing the technical manuals, she could hear the sound of vehicles arriving outside the hangar. Word had spread even further, and it seemed like half the base had turned out to watch her either succeed spectacularly or fail publicly. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand. The modified A-10 was indeed a complex machine, but every aircraft operated on the same basic principles: lift, thrust, weight, and drag. Everything else was just details. 25 minutes later, she felt as ready as she was going to be. The engines, the weapon systems, the flight controls, the emergency procedures. She had absorbed as much information as possible in the limited time available. As she prepared to start the engines, Sarah caught sight of Harrison through the cockpit window. He was standing with a group of other officers, and his expression suggested someone watching a car accident in slow motion. She was about to show him exactly how wrong he was. The A-10's engines came to life with a deep, throaty roar that seemed to shake the entire hangar. Sarah felt the vibration through her seat as the twin turbofan engines spooled up to operational power. Every gauge and display in the cockpit flickered to life, creating a symphony of electronic beeps and warnings that gradually settled into the normal operational pattern. Through her headset, she heard the voice of Captain James Wright, the air traffic controller assigned to monitor the exercise. "Hawkeye 1, this is Tower Control. You are cleared for engine startup and systems check. Weather conditions are marginal with gusting crosswinds at 15 to 20 knots. Are you sure you want to proceed with this exercise?" Sarah keyed her radio. "Tower Control, Hawkeye 1. Systems are green across the board. Request clearance to taxi." There was a pause before Wright responded. "Hawkeye 1. Be advised that several senior officers have requested I remind you that there is no shame in postponing this exercise until conditions improve." Sarah almost smiled. Even now, people were trying to give her an excuse to back down. "Tower Control, Hawkeye 1 is ready to proceed as scheduled. Request taxi clearance to runway 27. Cleared to taxi. Hawkeye 1. Contact ground control on frequency 121.9. As Sarah began taxiing the massive aircraft out of the hangar, she immediately felt the differences that Chief Santos had warned her about. The A-10 was heavier and more powerful than anything she had flown before, but it was also more responsive to control inputs than she had expected. The modified engines provided tremendous thrust, and she had to be careful not to over-control during the taxi phase. The wind was indeed gusting strongly across the airfield, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to weathercock into the wind as she maneuvered toward the active runway. Several times, sudden gusts threatened to push her off the taxiway centerline, requiring quick rudder corrections to maintain directional control. As she approached the runway, Sarah could see vehicles lined up along the flight line. It looked like every off-duty person on the base had turned out to watch the exercise. Some were clearly hoping to see her succeed, while others seemed to be waiting for a spectacular failure. "Hawkeye 1, Tower Control. You are number 1 for departure on runway 27. Wind is 240 at 18 gusting to 25 knots. Surface winds are creating significant crosswind conditions. Do you require additional time for preparation?" "Negative, Tower Control. Hawkeye 1 is ready for takeoff." Sarah turned onto the runway and lined up with the center line. The A-10 felt solid and planted on the ground, but she knew that the real test would come once she was airborne. The crosswinds would make takeoff challenging, and the modified flight characteristics would require constant attention once she was in the air. She advanced the throttles gradually, feeling the enormous power of the modified engines pushing the aircraft forward. The acceleration was impressive for such a large aircraft, and within moments she was approaching rotation speed. The crosswind tried to push her off the runway center line, but she countered with rudder input and a slight amount of aileron deflection. At the appropriate speed, Sarah pulled back on the stick and the A-10 lifted off smoothly. The transition from ground to air was surprisingly gentle, but almost immediately she felt the aircraft wanting to roll to the right, due to the engine modifications that Santos had mentioned. She corrected quickly, using a combination of aileron and rudder inputs to maintain wings-level flight. "Tower Control, Hawkeye 1 is airborne and climbing. Switching to departure control. Roger, Hawkeye 1. Contact departure on frequency 124.8. Good hunting. As Sarah climbed through 1,000 feet, she began to get a feel for the A-10's unique flight characteristics. The aircraft was stable and predictable, but it required a different flying technique than the sleeker fighter aircraft she was accustomed to. The A-10 was built for survivability rather than speed, with redundant systems and armored protection that made it incredibly tough but also relatively slow. The real challenge would come when she reached the target area and had to demonstrate the precision flying that Harrison's scenario demanded. Close air support missions required pilots to operate at low altitudes while identifying and engaging ground targets, often while under fire from enemy forces. It was some of the most demanding flying in military aviation. Departure control. Hawkeye 1 requesting vectors to target area Bravo. Hawkeye 1. Fly heading 090. Descend and maintain 3,000 feet. You are cleared direct to target area Bravo. Be advised that simulated surface-to-air missile threats are active in that area. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began her descent toward the target area. As she descended, she reviewed the mission parameters in her mind. She would need to identify 3 separate ground targets, engage each one with simulated weapons fire, and then extract from the area while avoiding simulated missile threats. All of this would need to be accomplished while flying at low altitude in gusty wind conditions. The target area appeared ahead of her as a series of mock-up vehicles and structures arranged in a realistic combat scenario. From her current altitude, the targets looked tiny, almost impossible to distinguish from the surrounding terrain. She would need to descend much lower to acquire and engage them effectively. As she began her attack run, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with challenging flying. This was what she lived for. The moment when pilot, aircraft, and mission came together in perfect harmony. She was about to show everyone on that base exactly what she was capable of. The A-10 responded to her control inputs like a living thing, dropping toward the target area with the deadly grace of a hunting eagle. Below her, the ground targets waited, unaware that their destruction was only moments away. Sarah rolled the A-10 into a steep bank and began her first attack run. The ground rushed up toward her as she descended through 2,000 feet. The mock battlefield spreading out below like a deadly chessboard. Her target acquisition system locked onto the first target, a simulated enemy tank positioned behind a ridgeline. The crosswinds that had challenged her during takeoff were even more problematic at low altitude. Gusts of wind buffeted the aircraft, requiring constant control inputs to maintain her attack heading. The A-10's heavy armor plating and low wing loading helped it punch through the turbulence. But Sarah still had to fight to keep the target centered in her heads-up display. Target acquired, she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the bouncing and shaking of the aircraft. Commencing attack run on primary target. At 800 feet above ground level, Sarah squeezed the trigger, simulating a burst from the A-10's massive GAU-8 cannon. The targeting system recorded a direct hit, and she immediately pulled up and to the right, beginning a climbing turn to set up for the second target. Direct hit on primary target, came the voice of the range controller. Proceed to target 2. As Sarah climbed and maneuvered toward the second target, she began to appreciate the true complexity of the modified A-10. The additional engine power made the aircraft more agile than a standard Thunderbolt, but it also required more precise control inputs. Too much throttle, and the aircraft would accelerate rapidly and overshoot the target. Too little, and she would fall behind the attack timeline. The second target was a simulated mobile missile launcher, positioned in an open area with minimal terrain masking. This would require a different attack approach, a low-level run that would expose her to theoretical enemy fire for a longer period. Sarah descended to 500 feet and accelerated toward the target. The A-10's distinctive engine noise filled the cockpit as she pushed the throttles forward, the twin turbofans responding with increased power. The aircraft felt alive beneath her, responding to her control inputs with surprising precision for such a large machine. Warning tones began sounding in her headset as the simulated surface-to-air missile sights locked onto her aircraft. Red warning lights flashed on her instrument panel, indicating that she was being painted by enemy radar systems. In a real combat situation, this would be the moment when missiles would be launched toward her aircraft. Hawkeye 1, you have multiple SAM threats tracking. Recommend immediate evasive action. Sarah ignored the warnings and pressed her attack. She had committed to the run, and breaking off now would mean missing the target and failing the exercise. The target grew larger in her display as she closed the distance, fighting through the simulated missile threats and the increasingly turbulent air. At the last possible moment, she fired on the target and immediately broke hard left, pulling maximum G-forces as she tried to evade the simulated missiles. The A-10 groaned and shuddered under the stress, but its robust construction allowed it to handle maneuvers that would have torn apart a lighter aircraft. "Direct hit on Target 2, announced the range controller. "Multiple missile launches simulated. Hawkeye 1, you are taking evasive action." Sarah's evasive maneuvers took her behind a ridgeline, temporarily breaking the radar lock from the simulated missile sites. But she knew that the real test was still ahead of her. The third target was positioned in the most challenging location, a narrow valley surrounded by high terrain, requiring her to fly a precise approach while avoiding both the simulated threats and the actual terrain features. As she maneuvered toward the final target, Sarah felt the aircraft responding differently than it had during the earlier phases of the mission. The constant maneuvering and the stress of low-altitude flying had caused the engines to heat up, and the flight characteristics were subtly changing as a result. The valley approach required her to thread the needle between two ridgelines while descending rapidly toward the target. It was the kind of flying that required absolute precision and perfect timing. There was no room for error. Too high and she would miss the target. Too low and she would impact the terrain. Sarah rolled into a steep diving turn, using the terrain to mask her approach from the simulated enemy forces. The walls of the valley flashed past her wingtips as she descended through the narrow opening, the A-10's wings almost brushing the rocky outcroppings on either side. The target appeared directly ahead, a simulated command vehicle positioned at the head of the valley. Sarah had only seconds to acquire the target, line up her shot, and engage before the terrain forced her to climb out of the valley. Her hands moved with practiced precision across the controls, making minute adjustments to her flight path as she centered the target in her sights. The warning tones continued to sound as the simulated missile sites tried to regain their lock, but she blocked out the distractions and focused entirely on the task at hand. At 300 feet above the valley floor, Sarah fired her final simulated burst and immediately pulled into a climbing turn to clear the valley walls. The G-forces pressed her back into her seat as the A-10 climbed steeply, its powerful engines providing the thrust needed to escape the confined terrain. "Direct hit on Target 3, came the excited voice of the range controller. "Outstanding shooting, Hawkeye 1. All primary targets eliminated." But Sarah wasn't finished yet. The mission parameters required her to successfully extract from the target area while avoiding the simulated missile threats. She was still in hostile territory, and the simulated enemy forces would be doing everything possible to prevent her escape. As she climbed through 2,000 feet, multiple warning tones began sounding simultaneously. The simulated missile sites had reacquired her aircraft and were launching everything they had at the escaping A-10. Sarah's extraction would require all of her skill and the full capabilities of the modified aircraft. The real test was just beginning. The missile warning system erupted in a cacophony of electronic alerts as multiple simulated surface-to-air missiles tracked toward Sarah's aircraft. Red warning lights flashed across her instrument panel like angry fireflies, and the synthetic voice of the threat warning system announced, "Missile launch." "Missile launch," in urgent tones. Sarah threw the A-10 into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, using every technique she had learned during her years of combat flying. She deployed simulated chaff and flares while pulling the aircraft through a punishing series of turns and dives, trying to break the missile lock while avoiding the terrain that surrounded the target area. The modified engines proved their worth during the extraction phase. When Sarah needed maximum power to climb out of a diving turn, they responded instantly, providing the thrust necessary to keep the heavy aircraft aloft despite the extreme maneuvering. When she needed to decelerate quickly to throw off a missile's tracking solution, the engines spooled down rapidly, allowing her to execute maneuvers that would have been impossible in a standard A-10. "Hawkeye 1, you have multiple missiles inbound," announced the range controller, his voice tight with concentration. "First missile impact in 30 seconds. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled the aircraft into a steep dive, using the terrain to mask her heat signature from the simulated infrared-guided missiles. The valley walls flashed past her canopy as she descended at maximum speed, the A-10's airframe groaning under the stress of the high-speed descent. At the last possible moment, she pulled out of the dive and skimmed along the valley floor, using the rocky walls to block the radar-guided missiles from maintaining their lock. It was dangerous flying. One mistake would result in controlled flight into terrain, but it was the only way to defeat the multiple missile threats. First missile defeated, called the range controller. Second missile still tracking. Sarah pulled up and over a ridgeline, then immediately rolled into another diving turn, presenting the smallest possible target to the tracking systems. The A-10 responded to her control inputs like an extension of her own body, following every command with precision despite the extreme forces being applied to the airframe. The second simulated missile passed harmlessly behind her aircraft as she executed a perfectly timed defensive maneuver, but there were still more threats to deal with, and her fuel was beginning to run low from all the high-power maneuvering. "All missiles defeated," announced the range controller with audible admiration. "Hawkeye 1, you are clear of the threat area. Outstanding flying." Sarah leveled the aircraft and began climbing toward her recovery altitude, finally allowing herself to breathe normally for the first time since beginning the attack run. The mission had been a complete success. All targets destroyed, all threats evaded, aircraft and pilot intact. But as she began the flight back to base, Sarah realized that she had only completed half of Harrison's challenge. She still had to land the modified A-10 safely, and the crosswinds that had challenged her during takeoff had only gotten stronger during the hour she had been airborne. Tower control. Hawkeye 1 requesting vectors for recovery to base. Hawkeye 1 tower control. Outstanding work out there. Fly heading 270, descend to pattern altitude. Be advised that winds have increased to 250 at 25, gusting to 35 knots. The crosswind component is significant. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. Landing any aircraft in those wind conditions would be challenging, but landing the modified A-10 with its changed flight characteristics would be extremely difficult. A single mistake during the approach could result in a ground loop, gear collapse, or worse. As she approached the airfield, Sarah could see the crowd of spectators that had gathered to watch her landing. Every vehicle on the base seemed to be parked along the flight line, and she could make out dozens of figures standing in the wind, watching her approach. The crosswind hit her aircraft as soon as she entered the traffic pattern, pushing her sideways and forcing her to crab the aircraft into the wind to maintain her desired ground track. The A-10's high sides acted like a sail, catching the wind and requiring constant rudder corrections to maintain directional control. Hawkeye 1, turn base leg. Caution wind shear reported by previous aircraft on final approach. Sarah acknowledged the warning and began her turn to the base leg of the traffic pattern. The wind shear made the aircraft buck and bounce unpredictably, and she had to work constantly to maintain proper airspeed and altitude. As she turned onto final approach, the full force of the crosswind became apparent. The aircraft wanted to drift sideways off the runway centerline, requiring her to maintain a significant crab angle to track straight down the runway. She would need to straighten the aircraft at the last moment before touchdown, a maneuver that required perfect timing and precise control inputs. Hawkeye 1, cleared to land runway 27, wind 240 at 30, gusting to 40 knots. The runway grew larger in her windscreen as she descended on final approach. Sarah could feel the aircraft fighting her constantly, the crosswind trying to push her off the centerline while the wind shear caused sudden changes in airspeed and altitude. She had to make continuous control inputs to keep the approach stable. At 200 feet above the ground, a sudden gust of wind caught the aircraft and pushed it violently to the right. Sarah immediately applied full left rudder and opposite aileron, fighting to regain control as the runway appeared to slide sideways beneath her aircraft. The crowd of spectators below seemed to hold their breath as the massive A-10 struggled against the elements, its pilot fighting to bring it safely home. This was the moment that would determine whether Sarah Mitchell had truly mastered the challenge that Harrison had thrown at her. The A-10 dropped toward the runway like a controlled avalanche, its massive bulk fighting against the crosswinds that threatened to push it off the center line. Sarah's hands moved continuously on the controls, making small corrections to counter every gust and wind shear that tried to destabilize her approach. At 50 feet above the runway, she began the critical transition from crabbed approach to straight landing. This was the moment when most crosswind landings failed. The pilot had to kick out the crab angle using rudder while simultaneously lowering the upwind wing with aileron to prevent drift. Too much input and the aircraft would ground loop. Too little and it would slide off the runway. Sarah timed her inputs perfectly, using the A-10's responsive controls to straighten the aircraft just as the main landing gear touched down on the runway centerline. The contact was firm but controlled, and she immediately applied differential braking and rudder to keep the aircraft tracking straight as it decelerated. But the challenge wasn't over yet. As the A-10 slowed, the crosswind had more time to act on the aircraft's large vertical surfaces, trying to weathercock it into the wind. Sarah had to maintain constant pressure on the controls to keep the aircraft pointing down the runway as it rolled out. The nose wheel touched down smoothly, and Sarah gradually reduced power while maintaining directional control with rudder and differential braking. The A-10 finally came to a stop on the center line. Its mission completed successfully despite the challenging conditions. Hawkeye 1. Tower control. Welcome home. That was exceptional flying under difficult conditions. Taxi to the ramp and contact ground control. As Sarah taxied back toward the hangar, she could see the crowd of spectators beginning to disperse, but many remained, obviously waiting to see what would happen next. She had completed Harrison's challenge flawlessly, but she knew that proving her point would require more than just technical success. She shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the mission. As the whine of the turbofans died away, the relative silence of the hangar seemed almost overwhelming after an hour of constant engine noise and radio chatter. Chief Master Sergeant Santos was the first person to reach the aircraft as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit. The veteran maintainer's face showed a mixture of relief and admiration. "Captain, I've been working on aircraft for over 2 decades, and I've never seen flying like that. The way you handled those crosswinds on landing. Most pilots would have gone around at least once in conditions like that." Sarah removed her helmet and ran her fingers through her sweat-dampened hair. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. "How did the aircraft perform?" she asked, her professional instincts taking over even in the moment of triumph. "Like a dream, according to the telemetry. You pushed it right to its limits during those evasive maneuvers. But everything stayed well within operational parameters. The modified engines performed exactly as designed." As Sarah finished securing her gear and completing the post-flight paperwork, she became aware of a commotion near the hangar entrance. A group of officers was approaching, led by Colonel Chen and Lieutenant Commander Harrison. The expressions on their faces told the whole story. Harrison looked like a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse. His confident smirk had been replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief, and he seemed to have difficulty making eye contact with anyone. Colonel Chen, on the other hand, looked pleased but not entirely surprised. Sarah suspected that the base commander had been hoping for exactly this outcome from the beginning. "Captain Mitchell," Chen began formally, "I want to commend you on an exceptional demonstration of airmanship. The mission was executed flawlessly under challenging conditions, and your landing in those crosswinds was particularly impressive." "Thank you, sir. The aircraft performed beautifully once I got used to its characteristics." Harrison stepped forward reluctantly, clearly struggling with what he had to say. "Captain, I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my respect. What you did today was extraordinary by any standard." Sarah studied his face for a moment, looking for any sign of insincerity, but she saw only genuine remorse and newfound respect. "I appreciate that, Harrison, but this was never just about proving myself to you. This was about proving that competence and skill have nothing to do with gender. You've certainly done that," said Major Rodriguez, who had arrived with the group. "I've been flying for 15 years and I wouldn't have attempted that mission in those conditions." "You made it look routine." Word of Sarah's successful flight spread through the base within hours. Pilots who had remained silent during previous discussions about women in combat suddenly found their voices, speaking openly about their respect for her achievement. The change in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. That evening, as Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the mission debriefing reports, she reflected on what had transpired. She had succeeded in proving her point, but she also understood that this was just one battle in a larger war for equality and respect. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Harrison standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I wanted to speak with you privately," he said, "about what happened today and about a lot of things." Sarah gestured for him to enter, curious about what he had to say. The conversation that followed would prove to be just as important as the flight itself. Harrison sat down heavily in the chair across from Sarah's desk, his usual confidence replaced by something she had never seen in him before: genuine humility. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the day's events hanging between them like a physical presence. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Harrison finally began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "about proving that competence isn't determined by gender. And I realized that I've spent years making assumptions that had no basis in reality." Sarah waited for him to continue, sensing that this was a conversation that had been building for much longer than just the past 24 hours. "The truth is," Harrison continued, "I was scared that if women could do everything I could do, then maybe I wasn't as special as I thought I was. Maybe my achievements weren't as significant if someone different from me, could achieve them too." "And now?" Sarah asked. Harrison looked up at her with eyes that showed a new kind of understanding. "Now I realize how stupid that was. Your success doesn't diminish mine. If anything, it makes both of our achievements more meaningful, because they're based on actual skill rather than arbitrary advantages." Sarah felt some of the tension she'd been carrying begin to ease. This wasn't just about winning a bet or proving a point. This was about changing minds and opening possibilities for the women who would come after her. "I want to do something," Harrison said suddenly. "I want to help make sure that other women don't have to prove themselves the way you had to today. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Over the following weeks, Harrison proved true to his word. He began speaking up when other pilots made dismissive comments about women in combat roles. He volunteered to mentor junior female officers, sharing his knowledge and experience without the condescension that had characterized his previous interactions. More importantly, he worked with Colonel Chen to develop new training protocols that would give all pilots, regardless of gender, equal opportunities to prove their capabilities in challenging aircraft and mission scenarios. Sarah's flight in the modified A-10 became legendary on the base, but not just because of the technical skill she had demonstrated. It became a symbol of what was possible when prejudice was replaced by merit-based evaluation. 6 months later, Sarah received orders for a new assignment: flight leader for an elite close air support squadron flying A-10 Thunderbolts in combat operations. It was the kind of position that had traditionally been reserved for the most experienced and capable pilots, regardless of gender. As she prepared to leave the base, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that evening in the officers' club. The casual sexism that had once permeated the military culture hadn't disappeared entirely, but it was no longer tolerated in the same way. Officers who had once remained silent during discriminatory conversations now spoke up, creating an environment where competence truly was the only measure that mattered. Harrison approached her as she was loading her gear into her car for the drive to her new assignment. He looked different somehow, more confident but also more humble, as if the experience had taught him something fundamental about leadership and respect. "I wanted to give you this before you left," he said, handing her a small wrapped package. Sarah opened it to find a model of an A-10 Thunderbolt, mounted on a wooden base with a brass nameplate that read, "Captain Sarah Mitchell, proving that the sky belongs to everyone who has the skill to fly it." "I had it made by the base hobby shop," Harrison explained. "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember. Well, to remember the day you changed everything." Sarah looked at the model, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also hope for the future and gratitude for the unexpected ally that Harrison had become. "Thank you," she said, "but you know, that day didn't change everything. It was just the beginning." Harrison smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was a smile without any trace of condescension or superiority. "You're right, but it was a hell of a beginning." As Sarah drove away from the base, she could see the A-10 Thunderbolts lined up on the flight line in her rearview mirror. They looked like sleeping giants waiting for their next mission, ready to prove once again that in the sky the only thing that mattered was the skill of the pilot who flew them. The road ahead stretched out before her, leading to new challenges and new opportunities to prove that excellence knew no boundaries. Behind her, she left a legacy that would open doors for every woman who dared to dream of touching the sky. The sound of jet engines echoed across the airfield as another pilot, this one a young woman fresh Out of flight school, climbed into an A-10. Cockpit for her first solo flight. Thanks to Sarah's courage and Harrison's change of heart, she would never have to prove that she belonged there. She would only have to prove that she could fly. And that, Sarah thought as she drove toward her new assignment, was exactly how it should be.